Hello and welcome back. I swear we have never tried recording this particular video before, and this will be the last time I try recording it again. But continuing on, yes, we've had to restart this one a half a dozen times. There, Nelson, I'll throw all that out there, so I'll force myself to keep this one. All right, before Nelson dives into putting together the actual projects, before he begins implementing our library, he's going to spend just a minute in this video here and talk about unit testing, and particularly in Unit. I know that we've got a lot of people out there in 3D Buzzland that are new to coding, and they've been following along with the MMO project, and they've probably never used unit testing before. And that's going to become very important, not in just the World Data Storage System, but especially when we start getting into the server and the other systems yet to come with the MMO class. So with that, I'm going to hand it on over to Nelson and let you talk about it, maybe give them an example or two, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so yes, we're doing unit testing, and I think we outlined the reasons beforehand. We need some sort of automated testing framework where we can define code that will run our other code through its paces in an automated and, most importantly, a consistent way as we continue to develop and refactor the database system.
Right.
So we've chosen to use NUnit, and NUnit is this on this website. NUnit.com if you want to go ahead and download it. Because we're using Visual Studio 2010 with NuGet, we're not going to be downloading it through this website. But if you are running Visual Studio 2008, then you will have to.
Okay.
So just head over to the download link, download the MSI, which will install NUnit as an executable you can run from your start menu. And yeah, so that's that.
And they've also got pretty good documentation over there as well.
Oh, yeah. And just like things like in Hibernate and every other N project, this is a port from an existing project in Java.
Okay.
But it is the most widely used unit testing framework in existence at the moment.
Okay. So it makes a lot of sense that we could use it. All right. Excellent. So now let's go ahead and jump back over into Visual Studio, because for those that are running 2010, you want to talk for just a second about NuGet? Just for those that haven't been following along with things like the ASP.NET development series.
Yeah, NuGet is this awesome new package manager for Visual Studio, which you might not have at the moment. So be sure to update your 2010 installation so you can get it. But what it is a package manager. So when we right-click references, we get this Manage NuGet Packages option. And NuGet, if you're familiar with Perl, NuGet is like CPAN. If you're familiar with PHP, NuGet is like Pear. If you're familiar with Ruby, NuGet is like Gems. So what it is it's this package manager where we can go online to these different sources. And right now I only have one source, the NuGet official package source. And we can download any package that is currently made available through NuGet. And the majority of these are open source projects that we can just hit install. It'll download the assemblies. It'll make modifications to your app.config if need be. It'll add in code. It'll run awesome PowerShell scripts. Essentially, it's a very powerful way to get code into your application. And it, like I said, it's relatively new, so I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't heard of it yet.
Okay.
So yeah. What we're going to do is we're going to search for NUnit. And we're going to hit the install button. And that's that.
Very cool.
We're also going to grab the Fluent Assertions extension methods for .NET Unit Test, which I'll talk about in a moment. So go ahead and make sure you install that as well. So now if we hit close, we see Fluent Assertions and NUnit framework and NUnit mocks and NUnit framework have been added. In addition, if you don't have ReSharper installed, like I said before, ReSharper does have built-in support for NUnit. Visual Studio does not. So if you don't have ReSharper installed, you're going to have to run these manually. And if you don't have ReSharper installed and you didn't download the MSI, you're not going to have the executable available to do these to run the test for you. But fortunately, if we go ahead and open up this folder in Windows Explorer for the project, we can see that there is, if we go back to the solution level, there's a folder called Packages that just arrived from NuGet. If we open this up, we'll see each of our packages that we've downloaded. If we go into NUnit, we have this tools folder. If we go into the tools folder, we have NUnit.exe. NUnit.exe is a little GUI application that you can, that's going to be the same application that you would get if you had installed the MSI package. If you do not have ReSharper, this is what you're going to have to use to run NUnit. Essentially, you just, there's documentation available for this, but essentially you just point it to a DLL. That's the result of your testing
project that's been compiled out, right?
And then you just hit like test run all and blah, blah, blah. And it's a really nice little GUI, but obviously I prefer the built-in ReSharper one. Okay.
And again, for everyone that's following along with us, seeing how Zach worked out that deal with JetBrains, there's no reason that everyone shouldn't have ReSharper.
Yep.
So there.
Okay, so let's talk about what tests are. I'm going to go ahead. Why am I doing that? So I'm going to go ahead and create a class. I'm going to call it test tests. It's the name of our class. And test classes, or test fixtures, are really just normal CLR types, really just normal C# classes that we add members to. So we can add any amount of members that we want. We can add, our own methods for helping us out with tests, for breaking apart common functionality, blah, blah, blah. We can create a whole project within this project for doing tests. But essentially what it boils down to are methods that are decorated with the test attribute.
Okay.
And the test attribute, if you saw the using NUnit framework pop-in, is part of the NUnit framework. Well, yes. If we have a reverted test attribute. And then you'll also notice that we got this little thing in our gutter. This is ReSharper allowing us to run these tests. So we can run just the individual tests. We can debug tests, which is also really nice, and so on. And you might be thinking, well, this is a class library. You can't execute a class library. And that's true. Basically what ReSharper is doing is it's compiling out our project, taking the DLL, loading it up in its own application, and then using reflection to run this code for us.
Very cool.
So let's go ahead and run this. So I just click on this and I hit run. And over on my second monitor, my unit tests appear.
Nice.
I'm going to dock this down here so it's more clear. So we just ran a test, and we have session 1. This is our current testing session. We can have as many sessions as we want, and those could constitute different tests that we want to run as we develop. And we see that here is our project, our testing project. Here's our namespace that our tests are in. Here's the test fixture, and then here are the individual unit tests. And you can specify different ways to organize that.
Cool.
So if I go ahead and double click on this, it'll bring me to this. That's also a nice little feature. I just double click and it brings me to the method. Now, how do we make a test fail? That's pretty much the most important thing. I guess I could briefly overview TDD.
Okay.
We're not going to be doing TDD, but whenever you hear anybody talking about unit test, TDD will come up. And TDD stands for test-driven development. Essentially, test-driven development can be summarized by red-green refactor. And what that means is that, let's go ahead and show you an example of a red. So we start off with code that doesn't work. TDD specifies that we start off code, we just throw code into here that uses classes and methods that might not even exist. We could say var database equals new database.store10. And now obviously this code isn't going to work. This test is going to fail. Well, it's not even going to build. But this is essentially where TDD starts. And then basically we fill out this test in its entirety. We look at all the build errors and we fix them. So we say, let's create a class called database. Let's give him a method called store that accepts an integer. Now we run the test again. And it's green. So this test is good. Now we can write another test, like public void this blah. Sorry, I'm not good with names. I should be.
What are you talking about? That's a classic name.
So let's say we say database store, and then we also want to say assert that r equal database get And now we try to run this, and we get a build error because we don't have a get method. So let's go ahead and add that method. And then if we really wanted to be TDD zealots, we would leave the not implemented exception in there. We'd run it again, and we would get a red. So now we have to refactor for it to work. So we can just say return 10, and so on. And then we might make another test called if I store 10, I retrieve 10. And then the unit tests are essentially defining the functionality of our system. We're not going to be doing, like I said, we're not going to be doing this approach, but I just want to give a quick overview of something because you've probably heard that term before.
Right. You also want, I mean, obviously TDD is very common, but BDD is becoming pretty, it's getting there. Do you want to spend just a second just talk about that?
Well, behavioral driven design, or BDD, is about defining specifications in more or less an English language. And these specifications may not be written by business experts, and I mean business experts in another three-letter acronym, in the traditional DDD sense.
Right.
These are they won't necessarily be writing these, but the idea is that of BDD is that we write these really high-level English-looking tests that a business expert can look at and say, this is exactly what my system should do, or this is not exactly what my system should do. There's a bunch of different ways to do that. It was popularized mainly from the Ruby framework called Cucumber. And Cucumber literally let you do things like when I log into login.rb or whatever, then, and the syntax was literally like this. And through some magical text parsing and regular expressions, it was able to determine, okay, so when I see the pattern when I log into, then take this out and actually log into that page, and then do this and assert that and blah, 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 blah. So it's a very interesting thing. There is something in the .NET space. It is called something that I have forgotten.
Didn't it start with an S?
SpecFlow? No.
Yeah, something like that. You're close.
SpecFlow? No, it's not. Oh, it is SpecFlow.
Haha, I thought so. Like I said, you're close.
And yeah, SpecFlow, if you ever want to play with it, it's available on NuGet, like everything these days. And I'll just drag this. I cheated. I Googled for it. But this is an example of, this is code. Literally.
That's crazy.
Is being parsed. And then it passes and fails depending on that.
That's awesome.
So, yeah.
Okay, now before we get too much further from your little example, do you want to spend just a minute and talk about assertions, since you've used an assert there?
Okay, assertions are interesting. They're usually used for things that should never happen. And they usually only are enabled in debug builds. And you commonly use assertions to say, if this has happened, the world has ended, and yeah, the universe has imploded, and the program should no longer be capable of executing. So they're like validating things that shouldn't be null and blah, blah, blah. Well, no, they shouldn't be used for things that shouldn't be null. They should be things like, I can't bring up an example, but something that should never, ever, ever happen. They're used as a sanity test. In this context, the interesting attribute about assertions in .NET is they raise exceptions. And raising exceptions is the mechanism in which NUnit and the built-in Visual Studio testing framework, that's the mechanism in which they detect an error has happened. Mm-hmm. So, for example, you'll see, if I go ahead and run this, and it's going to be all green, what if I say that get now returns 11? So I did a bunch of code, I was working all day on some blah or something, and for some reason I made get now return 11. And all my code looks like it's working, but before I check in, I'm going to go ahead and run my unit tests. And then boom, we get an exception. And we get the exception from this assertion. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
So more or less, this would be the same as a database.get does not equal 11, throw new invalid operation exception, not IO exception, invalid operation. I'm trying to use a new camel casing.
You want to say not equal to 10?
Not equal 10. So this would be essentially an equivalent. So now if we were to run this test, we'll get an error. This test failed.
Right.
So I guess we can also talk now about fluent assertions. And fluent assertions is this neat little framework that lets us fluently define things that should or should not fail, or should not behave in a particular way. So for example, I could say database.get should, and this is an extension method. And the second I type it in, ReSharper is going to tell me you need to add this using statement. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. For those of you who don't have ReSharper for whatever reason, that added in using fluent assertions at the top. So now I can say should, and then I can do dot, and I can say should be 10. And through the magic of that is the .NET generic system, which is so much better than C++'s or Java's, and type inference and all that awesome stuff. This basically works in a lot of cases. Like I could say, hello should be world. It's a really nice little framework. So I can go ahead and run this again, and we'll see we have an error. Expected 10, but found 11. And the fluent assertions has a bunch of awesome stuff that we won't necessarily go in immediately. But it's also interesting because it allows you to assert on things like this is actually something I was meaning to bring up in Nelson's Corner at some point. But extension methods on delegates, have you ever heard of that?
No, I've not done that actually.
Let's say we have code that should throw an exception.
Okay.
So let's say database.store 5 or 4, because that's what came out. Let's say this should throw an invalid operation exception because you should never store 4 in a database. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this in a delegate. So we're going to do action stuff that should fail, and we're going to wrap that in lambda.
Okay.
Right? So now what we could do is say stuff that should fail should throw invalid operation exception. Import that, or I misspelled it. And I can't type. There we go. So now we can say run this again, and we'll get an error because system invalid operation exception was not thrown. So now we can say if my int equals 4, throw new invalid operation exception. And now we run again, and we get success.
Nice.
So this is the first instance. I discovered this a while ago, but this is the first instance that adding extension methods to a delegate was incredibly awesome.
Wow, that is very cool.
And then you can also do things like database get should be positive and be greater or equal to 3, and so on and so on. It's a fluent interface.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, so is there anything else that well, one more thing.
Okay.
Let's say you have code that you want to happen every time that a test is run, because you see we're instantiating this database twice. That's going to get a bit obnoxious. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a setup and a tear down. And then I'm going to decorate them with 2 attributes. Setup is going to get the setup attribute. And the teardown is going to get the teardown attribute.
Never saw it coming.
So now we can say, we can factor this out into a field called _database. Bring this out, delete that, change it to _database. So now instead of instantiating a new database, we're relying on a private field. In our setup, we can go ahead and say database equals new database. And in our teardown, let's say that our database implements iDisposable for whatever reason. And in our teardown, we could say database dispose. And both of these pieces of code are going to execute every single time that a test is run. So I can go ahead and run, and we see we have success because this code was run. And I can go ahead and verify that by showing another awesome feature of the ReSharper integration with NUnit. And that is I can hit this little bug button, and boom, it launches I'm not used to this resolution. So now we're in debug mode, and you see that we did hit this setup once. And then if we step through, we see that we go through this blah, and we get that exception, of course. But that gets swallowed by fluent assertions. And then we go through the teardown, and then we should go through a setup again in a second. Yep, we go through a setup again for this is test messed with and then we go through the teardown again.
Right. Cool.
And then we end.
That's awesome.
So, any other?
No, I think this was very beneficial. Exactly what I was looking for. Just kind of a quick overview to the idea of unit testing, and then talking about NUnit and those that do not have ReSharper, what they need to do, and if they don't have NuGet as well, how to get it all set up, and some very simple examples. And I'm very happy that you were able to talk about assertions, seeing how they, at the end of the day, they really do play a very vital role in unit testing. So, yeah, unless there's anything else you want to add, we can wrap this one up and move into starting to create some of our abstracts for our library.
Yep. And if you want to learn more about fluent assertions, it's just fluentassertions.codeplex.com.
Very cool. Okay, well, thank you guys very much, and we will catch you in the next video.